welcome to this live debate. Before we start, I would like to welcome Dom Jolly, who's been a fantastic supporter of the Syria crisis appeal, to say a few words. Dom.
Thank you very much. Hello everyone. I won't take up too much time because obviously there are some real experts in their field, but I just wanted to sort of highlight what the DEC and certainly Save the Children are doing in Syria. I spent 3 days about 2 weeks ago out in Jordan, visited the Satari refugee camp, visited some of the refugees that live within host communities, and I was just really astonished at the scale of the situation with 8,000 people crossing the Syrian border every day. Do I need a mic? Thank you. Hello. With 8,000 people crossing the Syrian border every day, estimates saying that there are going to be over 1 million Syrian refugees in Jordan alone, a country that has only 6 million people in it. And I think the scale of the situation is huge. And I was so impressed with what Save the Children are doing, especially obviously regarding children, setting up things like child-friendly spaces within camps, allowing kids the opportunity to meet other kids, to sort of talk about the stuff they've been through, get basic education. And I really would appeal anyone. I know you're bored of people appealing for things, but I really would urge you to give some money, because I've seen what it does, and it does an amazing stuff. But I won't hang around too much longer, so I will introduce you to the panel of experts. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dom. Really appreciate how Dom's actually been out there to Jordan's Atari camp and highlighting the plight of the Syrian refugees and coming back and highlighting the case to support the Syria crisis appeal amongst the media. So thank you so much, Dom. Appreciate it. A huge welcome to everybody here at the BT Tower in sunny London today. We also have many people following us live on Twitter and online. So occasionally you might see me flicking over to my iPad to check what's going on there. Great. A huge thanks to BT, who have given us this wonderful setting today. Not only are they supporting us today with this event, they're also supporting the Disasters Emergency Committee with processing our donations behind the scenes, and they do that remarkably well and smoothly. So thank you so much, BT. Why we're here today? Well, 2 years ago, the Arab Spring reached Syria, and unfortunately that turned into a civil war. Now, in the last 2 months, we've seen a deterioration of the situation. 70,000 people have lost their lives. 2 million people trapped inside Syria trying to get out. 1 million people fled into neighbouring countries such as Jordan and Lebanon. And the dire needs include food, water and shelter. The DEC, due to the deteriorating situation, launched an appeal last Thursday with the support of the member agencies, the 14 great member agencies, and our rapid response network, including the BBC, ITV and BT. And so far we've raised £5 million due to the generosity of the British public. Right, so today we have with us our distinguished guests, and I'll introduce them from the extreme right on the end. Julie Brothwell, who's the Programme Manager with the British Red Cross. Welcome, Julie. Julie's just back from a 2-month mission to Beirut, monitoring the British Red Cross's refugee response in Syria and Turkey. Also visited Damascus, where you saw the work of the Syrian Arab Red Crescent. And over 25 years' work experience in the humanitarian field. Welcome, Julie. Next to Julia, we have Oliver Pearce from Christian Aid, who is the Middle East officer. Welcome, Oliver. Thank you. Oliver's also back from Lebanon, where he visited Palestinian and Syrian refugees being helped by Christian Aid in Sidon. He also visited children who are receiving psychosocial support. Welcome, Oliver. Next to Oliver, we have Nigel Timmins, who's the Deputy Humanitarian Director for Oxfam, also back from Jordan and Lebanon, having visited refugee camps in those countries. Nigel also has 20 years' experience in relief and development. Welcome, Nigel. Thank you. Next to Nigel, we have Andrew Wander, who's the emergency journalist for Save the Children. Andrew has been based in Zatari camp, so welcome, and works with Save the Children. Next to Andrew, we have Justin Byworth, who's the Chief Executive of World Vision and also a trustee of the Disasters Emergency Committee. Justin also has many years, over 20 years experience in the humanitarian and development field. So altogether, we have a panel who demonstrate over 100 years of experience in humanitarian response. I might add none of them are over 100 years individually, so welcome to you all. In terms of the process of today's debate, we will obviously be welcoming questions from the audience here in BT Tower, and we'll also be taking questions from people following Twitter and those online. Just a reminder for those that do ask some questions, please do speak into the mic so that those following us online can hear what you're asking. Thank you so much. Right, so the first question, anyone? Okay, let's go online and check what we have. Do we know how many of the Syrian refugees are children? From James Jacobs on Twitter. Did anybody want to take that?
I can take that. You can say the children.
Okay.
We think about half of the Syrian refugees are children. We know that in the refugee camps in Jordan and in Lebanon, about 50% of the people coming across are under the age of 18, and they're coming largely with their mothers. There seems to be a sort of gender differential between men and women. So we're seeing an even split, boys and girls, tending to come across with their mums or their relatives, arriving absolutely sort of petrified, as you can imagine. They've literally run for their lives through this conflict. They've broken through the border, managed to get across the border. They arrive in refugee camps, and particularly in Zutri, where I was most recently, you get a real sense amongst the children of like, is this it? This is where we're going to be now? It's a camp that wasn't even there 8 months ago, in the middle of a desert. There's nothing. It feels permanent, but there's nothing really permanent about it for these children. They all want to go home, and anyone who asks them, what their hopes are for the future, is to go back to Syria and get on with their lives. And that's really what comes across so strongly when you speak to these children. They haven't been to school a lot of times. They haven't been able to play. Haven't been able to be children. Their childhoods have been stolen from them. And I think that's one of the greatest tragedies of this situation, is the disproportionate impact this conflict's having on children.
Thank you, Andrew. We have a question from the audience. Gentleman there.
Hello, James Denslow. Yesterday, the BRICS summit in Durban called for full and unimpeded access to humanitarian agencies into Syria. I wondered whether you could describe the problems you're having cross-border and cross-line in terms of actually accessing those who need aid.
Thank you. Nigel, would you want to take that one?
Yeah, sure. Syria at the moment is obviously split in sort of politically between the opposition areas and areas held by the government, but those lines keep changing. At the moment, working within government areas, you need government registration, and the government has registered some new agencies, but a relatively modest number, and we would certainly like to see more agencies able to work within government areas, and we've been trying to pursue registration ourselves as Oxfam. Some agencies are accessing from the north, they're getting it from Turkey, but I think there are multiple front lines. The opposition isn't a single cohesive group. There's multiple different opposition groups, they have slightly different agendas, and negotiating that is a real challenge. I think, for example, the American president has suffered a number of deaths amongst its volunteers. So it is both from a
To add to Nigel's point, I would say that a number of DEC member organisations are working with local partner organisations in Syria, which allows us to access people in Syria on different sides of the many front lines that there are in that country. So whilst it's very difficult for outside international organisations to get registration if they haven't previously already had it, we are able to partner with a number of organisations within Syria who are able to access a number of the affected populations that are really being badly affected by the deteriorating situation in different parts of the country.
Just on that, the Syrian Arab Red Crescent was one of the few organisations that had a countrywide network before the crisis. It has its 14 branches, 80 sub-branches, and as long as we can get aid to those structures, then it's relatively easy to reach people in kind of quite remote communities. But the problem is crossing the front lines to get to those branches and sub-branches.
Thank you.
Just make one other point. I think it's also important to recognise that the Syrian people aren't kind of just sat on their hands. What's quite exciting is some of the stories of people where they're sort of self-organising. I know, for example, in some of the cities like Aleppo and Homs, there have been real problems with waste management. And the refuse collection system has broken down. But people have organised themselves. People have got together and said, let's work and cooperate to sort this out. So there's quite a lot of sort of spontaneous people coming together to help each other out going on.
Thank you. A question from Laura Cosset on Twitter. What is the political solution in Syria in order to end this war? Right. Anybody want to volunteer for that one? Okay.
You know, the Disaster Emergency Committee and all the members, World Vision and all of us here, we're humanitarian agencies first and foremost, and one of our most important pledges is to be neutral and impartial in any situation. But of course, we all know that war causing such huge suffering. Actually, the Foreign Secretary described it on Monday as potentially the situation is fast becoming the greatest humanitarian catastrophe of the 21st century. I don't think he's exaggerating. And of course, the political situation, the security situation, needs to be addressed by all those involved in that. In order to do that, I myself have met with the Foreign Office about Syria in the last month or so on this, and I know many of us are working with the British government and working with the UN system and working with all the other actors to try and make sure there's humanitarian access, as we just heard. But also, we're keeping in touch with the wider political situation so that we can do our jobs as effectively as possible. But without a doubt, the humanitarian situation is what we're here for, but without a doubt, without a long-lasting political solution, the humanitarian situation will only get worse. And what we will do will be stemming, reducing the impact of that tragically.
Certainly, I think we all would welcome a political solution to this crisis, but in the meantime, there's a huge need out there that we all need to get behind. Thank you. Any questions from the audience? I know many of you are busy tweeting away on your phones. Lady at the front here.
Hi, my name is Sylvia Pressy. Thank you for having us here. I was just wondering, it's really good that you're working with bloggers here in the UK. I'm interested whether you're working with the networks of citizen journalists on the ground in Syria.
Anyone?
I can't, to be honest with you, I don't know directly whether we're working specifically with groups of citizen journalists. I do know that there have been lots of attempts to mobilise people within the region, and certainly there was recently an interagency effort to organise a vigil during the 2-year anniversary, if that's the right word, of the start of the conflict, which brought together lots of different groups from across the Middle East of ordinary people showing their solidarity with the ordinary Jordan, many of the countries in the region where people came together and just lit a candle just to remember the victims of the conflict.
Thank you. A question from Laura Cosset on Twitter. Why is there a huge percentage of the population fleeing? What is the level of violence and the danger of those still within the country?
Yeah, speak to that. Maybe I'll just give an example of an individual situation, because I think that brings it to life for all of us, especially if you imagine 1 in 5 of the country fleeing. Imagine London and Manchester plus some more than that fleeing our country. It is unimaginable, the scale of this, but then it becomes real when we see it at the very human level. And we spoke about the situation of children. We've been working with a young girl, Hebo. She's 14 years old, and she actually had a serious medical condition, a hole in the heart, that she couldn't get treatment for within Syria because the medical system, the hospitals, are just stopped functioning there. Last Friday, the road opened up for 2 hours, and her family, I think 5 or 6 of them, fled with nothing but the clothes on their back. And actually her cousin, her cousin was killed en route with shrapnel actually literally entering her heart and killing her, and her father carried her body across the border, carried her dead body across the border and said, we can't leave it here, we have to bury her in Lebanon, which is where we met with them. And they're now living with 21 people, 13 children among them, in just a bare, empty, cold village in the Bakar Valley. But they're fleeing even fleeing through the flames, through the bullets, through the bombs, facing death like that family to get up because they, in many cases, face what some of these people have seen, and particularly, as Andrew said, the impact on children, what they've seen and experienced is no child should have to do that. To say it's traumatic is to understate it.
And we know that 2 million are still trapped inside Syria trying to get out. Andrew, did you want to add on?
Yeah, I'd just like to say that in December there were 500,000 people who had fled. There's now 1 million people. That's a huge escalation. And I think that's indicative of an escalation within the country. A tipping point's been reached there where it's not just bombs and bullets, although they're a huge threat continuing. It's the basic things, the building blocks of life. It's food in the shops. It's turning on the tap and getting water that comes out, clean water that you can drink. It's about having heating for your place. Even if you're not displaced in Syria now, life's getting harder and harder and more difficult. And I think a point's been reached where you don't need to be displaced. You don't even need to be that close to the fighting anymore, this conflict to be having a really devastating impact on your life, which is why I think more people have decided to cut their losses and make that very dangerous journey, often separating from their families along the way. You know, it's very common to hear people who have lost family members in the rush to escape Syria and arrive in these refugee settlements. And I think there's a tendency to think that when they get to the refugee settlements, everything's all right. But that's just the beginning of a whole new set of problems. And so, obviously, at source, where these people are coming from, the situation's deteriorating. But also in the refugee camps, that escalation is making the situation there much more difficult as well.
Thank you. Oliver?
Absolutely right. The number of people leaving Syria is increasing. Around the start of the year, we were seeing about 1,000 people every day leaving Syria to neighbouring countries. Now it's something like 8,000 every day. So it's a much greater number of people leaving, and therefore we're going to expect increasing numbers of refugees arriving in neighbouring countries. So not only are we seeing an impact on people in Syria and those people leaving Syria, we're also seeing an impact on those neighbouring countries themselves. So in a country like Lebanon, with a population of around 4 million people, to try and absorb within its population something like an additional 10%, around at least at the moment 300,000 registered refugees and probably many more unregistered refugees, is really challenging for those neighbouring countries. And in countries like Lebanon, there don't tend to be like a sort of official refugee camps that you might have in other countries. And new refugees are finding it increasingly difficult to find shelter when they do flee in countries like Lebanon. But rents are very high earlier, and people that are fleeing now are often leaving Syria with fewer assets, less money, and don't quite know where to go when they arrive in countries like Lebanon. So the needs are getting more acute, and that's not only for the refugees fleeing, but also the pressures on the neighbouring countries themselves.
Thank you, Oliver. Certainly when I was in Lebanon, the situation in Lebanon was described to me as being a tipping point. And I think nobody wants to see Lebanon into another civil war, so it's really precarious there. Any questions from the audience before we go back to Twitter? Lady over here, sorry. Yeah.
Hi, thanks for having us, as other people have said. I'm here from Cairns National. I just wanted to ask, and it leads on from the last point, what is being done specifically for refugees who find themselves in urban areas and obviously aren't in camp situations, and also for the communities that they're staying in?
Thank you. Julia, do you want to get that? Yeah.
Actually, the majority of people are living in hosted communities, certainly in Jordan and in Lebanon. Often they'll get a welcome pack from the humanitarian organisations that are meeting at the border, a very simple pack, food parcel, hygiene parcel, a kitchen set, and then some of them may not see kind of much assistance after that for quite some time. There is a fair amount of cash programming going on with the UN and other international organisations. But this has taken some time to set up, and where the voucher system's used or cash transfers are used, these are not something that kind of just kicks in overnight. There's a registration process to go through. It's keeping track of refugees as well. They don't just move across the border and settle in one place. They keep finding new places to go until they feel safe, until they have perhaps some kind of livelihoods support. It's a full-time job keeping track of the refugees in the neighbouring countries. But that's the system that we're trying to push at the moment. In Jordan and in Lebanon, you can buy things in the shops, so it makes it's entirely good sense to give people cash that they can use then to pay rent and to buy what they need, rather than what.
From Eleanor Mason on Twitter, how many volunteers in Syria have lost their lives trying to help and save other people?
Well, the Red Crescent has lost 17 volunteers who are on active duty. Other volunteers have also lost their lives, but they were not actively engaged in Red Crescent work. The UN has also lost a number of staff and volunteers, often caught in crossfire. The Red Crescent has around 9,000 volunteers. They're using about 3,000 at a time and kind of rotating them. The burnout rate, as you can imagine, is quite high. And they are also losing a lot of their volunteers because they themselves are displaced within Syria or are becoming refugees and fleeing across the border. So there's a constant drive to recruit new volunteers and get them trained up and actively involved in the humanitarian operation. But, yeah, 17 lives lost is a heavy burden on the organisation.
Okay, thank you. A question from the audience, lady over here on the left. Can you speak into the mic, please? Thank you.
Hi, I'm Siobhan from ActionAid. I just wanted to ask about what people thought about media coverage so far of the humanitarian situation, because obviously the Channel 4 News stuff recently has been brilliant, and hopefully that will mark a sea change. But up until now, there's been a lot of coverage of the conflict, but not as much as any of us would want on the humanitarian situation. And considering it is so bad, why do you think that is, and what can we as agencies do to change that?
Justine, do you want to answer this?
Sure, yeah. I mean, to be honest, I struggle to know whether to be heartbroken or to be full of rage about the fact that this should be the news story of the day. You know, I'm, as long with anyone British, whine about the winter going on and getting ready for a lovely Easter weekend. But today, in Syria, you know, people's lives have been broken and torn apart, and it should be the dominant story of the day. I think we probably all know that where there's conflict and complexity of different people involved, and there's no obvious perfect goodies and baddies in this, and there's no, you know, easy solutions. I think where there's complexity, sometimes that prevents people from speaking about it as clearly as they might. I think the horror of it as well sometimes turns people away. Plus, of course, the access that, you know, getting access to those places. Anyone that didn't watch the Channel 4 piece on Monday, I think it's almost a duty as a human being on this planet to do so and to do something about it in response to that. It's an untold horror that the world needs to hear about. And, you know, we're at the DEC, we're delighted with the generosity of the British public, giving more than £5 million already. But, you know, amongst our agencies, we've got unmet needs of more than £100 million in the things that we know we can do already. And that doesn't even begin to scratch the surface of the overall needs. So we need all the help we can get from the British public. And that does mean that we need the media to shine a light on what is, you know, what is largely an untold horror.
Thank you, Justin. So to all our followers out there on Twitter, please tweet away and tell people what the urgency is in Syria. We do need that support, and we need that message to be out there. Thank you. Okay, the next question from Leslie Sinaway on Twitter. Is it mostly women and children who are being affected, and why is this? And then the second question from a follower on Twitter. Are funds allocated for children's education 2 years plus? And to do with content that produce an illiterate generation? Andrew?
Yeah, on the first point, this is a conflict that is disproportionately affecting the civilian population. A lot of it's happening in urban areas where lots of ordinary families are living, and so it's not a distant front line with, you know, residential areas far away. This is being fought street to street in towns and villages across Syria, and that's having an impact on families. I think the reason that you see women and children more in this, certainly their homes and cutting their losses totally. And so what you often hear from refugees is, my husband stayed behind, he doesn't want to leave the house, because you don't know what's going to happen to it, and people don't want to lose that asset that they've got there. And second of all, people are more, they obviously want to keep their children safe, and so they're moving them that way. On the education point, education's been devastated. The Syrian education system's been absolutely devastated by this conflict. Children haven't been in school for up to 2 years now since the war started, and that's partly because teachers have fled, that's partly because displaced people are living in schools, it's partly because schools, being big municipal buildings, are being used in the fighting by both sides. So, you know, the education system's been devastated. There are big education initiatives with refugee populations who arrive in Jordan and Lebanon. We're working to get children back into education. We had a question about children who weren't living in camps. Well, they're getting education through the Jordanian system, and that's another way in which the Jordanians and surrounding countries are really stepping up and trying to provide for this enormous number of people who have turned up on their doorstep, desperate and asking for help. But it's very, very difficult, and we need resources to be able to do that. We need to open more schools in the big refugee camps. We need to make sure that the education systems within these countries are able to support extra lessons, and in some cases, you know, it's another, it's almost a doubling of the number of people that they need to educate. We see that Jordanian kids in school in the morning, Syrians in the afternoon, doing everything they can to get these kids back into education, because if you're out of education for years and you start losing that level of sort of potential, it's a tragedy, and people don't catch up, they don't get back, and you need to keep them in education for as long as possible, and to make sure that all kids have the chance to fulfil their potential.
Can I give an example from the refugee situation in Lebanon? Exactly that. So one village where Vision's working, there were 300 kids in the school, and now there's almost 1,000. We've got 200 or so literally being kind of having classes in like a car park by the side, in the yard by the side, out virtually in the open air, and another few hundred on a waiting list. And you know, so just imagine in primary school or secondary school here in the UK, suddenly doubling your numbers, you know, almost over, not quite overnight, but within a period of weeks or a couple of months. Imagine turning up at the school gate and finding, you know, just twice as many people. In that school alone, 3 teachers have resigned because they can't handle the stress of it and the pressure of it. So it's placing a huge burden, as you said, whether it's Jordan or Lebanon, a huge burden on their systems. And as you said, yourself, Saleh,
really about this as well is that it's really not just about education, it's about giving a structure back to kids in their lives, and that's what school's so important for. You see, whether it's in our kindergartens, withdrawn, very quiet, who come in, don't want to talk, don't want to, after a few weeks back in a school system, regardless of what they're learning almost, they're interacting with other children and they're beginning to put their lives back together again, and that's why this is so important.
Thank you. Oliver, you wanted to come in?
Yes, I really wanted to echo what my colleagues have been saying, in that schools, particularly in neighbouring countries, can't necessarily absorb all the arrivals that are coming from people fleeing Syria. So, for instance, in Lebanon, the official schools simply will not admit new arrivals after a certain point, and therefore we have refugee children who can't access schooling inside Lebanon. At Christian Aid, we're working with one of our local partner organisations to ensure that those children can get an alternative education provided by an NGO, that they are able to try and catch up, make sure that they're getting the right kind of support, psychosocial, as well as the direct lessons in classrooms, so that they will, on return to Syria, be able to rejoin schools, or in the medium term, be able to get into school in Lebanon. It's a really big challenge, but there are NGOs and other organisations that are well placed to provide children with that structure that Andrew mentioned and those opportunities that education brings.
Thank you. The good news is now, because of this event, our hashtag DEC Syria is actually trending on Twitter. So I think a lot of applause for everybody that made that possible. Well done. Thank you. A question for you, Nigel, from Matt Murray on Twitter. How is this crisis being viewed beyond the immediate and into the future? What are the signs and stories that are there of impact and hope?
I think one of the things that struck me talking to refugees was refugees who came out and they brought their savings with them, and they thought, this is a blip. This is, this is going to last 3 months, maybe 6. But this is Syria. This is a stable country. We'll sort it out, and then we'll go back. And actually now those people's resources are running out, and they're finding, oh, actually this is going on, and actually it's getting worse. And I think there's real fear. Certainly I met a lot of refugees who just expressed fear about what was happening now, what this meant for the future. I think one thing to get across is Syria was a middle-income country, and one of the things that struck me is the people I was meeting were like me. I was meeting restaurant owners, I was meeting people who worked for banks, I met a policeman. These are people who had professional careers. They had watched crises in other countries on their TV screens. They never expected this to happen to them. And the way the infrastructure is being torn apart, the damage in relationships between communities, that sense of fear of, well, how are we going to rebuild this, is quite palpable. So signs of hope, I think, the extent to which people keep communicating the message that there is an alternative to war, that there is an opportunity to build a different future, and to see other people from other countries standing in solidarity. People draw strength from that. People want, I think, a lot of refugees come out and say, where is everybody? Do people know what's going on in my land? And the extent to which we can communicate that solidarity does give hope to refugees.
Thank you, Nigel. Just a quick announcement. The hashtag DEC Syria has been so popular that spammers have also got to work, unfortunately. So can you please tweet or follow at DEC Appeal, please? That's at DEC Appeal. Thank you. Next question from a lady over here on my left.
The Human Care Foundation Worldwide. Firstly, thank you very much for hosting this. I've got a question for the panel. If the projected number of refugees is 3 million by June, what preemptive measures are being taken now to accommodate this influx in Jordan, Lebanon and Turkey?
Okay, thank you. Andrew.
We're struggling to keep up with the numbers that are coming in now, to be honest with you. Every day, thousands of people arriving across borders to surrounding countries. And the truth is, the resources aren't there to meet them, which is partly why this DEC appeal is happening. We've seen those projections. We're all working as hard as we can to make sure that the resources are there to meet them. But that's going to require an enormous effort, not just from the international community, but from people who support the DEC and the agencies who are part of the DEC, to make sure we are able to meet that demand. Zaatari camp, the biggest camp in Jordan at the moment, is like a construction site. Everywhere you look, there are new tents being put up, there's areas being cleared of the desert, there's rocks being laid down to prevent the dust blowing up. But, the sheer numbers arriving every single night are just putting such pressure on the resources of every agency working there and working across the region. It's very difficult to see how we'd absorb that number, which is why these emergency appeals are going out now.
I think we should recognise the general sentiments in countries, countries like Jordan and Lebanon, who have kept the borders open despite significant numbers of people coming across. Medical facilities have been made available for acute cases. Schools, I've seen here, teachers working double shifts in the schools just to accommodate the additional refugee children. So it is placing a huge burden on those surrounding countries. And I think the extent to which the international community can help those countries in their own response is an important
Situation different for urban refugees living in cities as compared with those living in camps. Maybe Andrew, you could pick up on this one.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was touched on a little bit earlier. Most refugees aren't living in camps. They're living in host communities. They're arriving there for various reasons, deciding that they're better off outside the camp structure, that they want to try and find work, and that's putting an enormous pressure on those host communities. You can imagine. I mean, I think the equivalent from Jordan to the UK is if 3 million people turned up in the UK, all looking for work, looking for ways to kind of make a living, at a time when we're having economic difficulties here. Jordan's having real economic difficulties as well, and so they're finding that an already difficult economy is made even more complicated by all these people turning up in desperate need, looking for any work they can get, So it's very, very difficult. People don't like being in camps, as far as, that's why I think you see more of them living outside. And I think that also some governments don't like having camps. I mean, in Lebanon, the history of refugee camps has not been a happy one. And I think that there's lots of reasons why there's a majority of people living in these urban settings. Partly, I think it's because they want to, get on and look after themselves, and partly because it feels easier to go home. I think you can just get back across.
Just perhaps, so again, when I was in Lebanon visiting there, even in Beirut, the capital city, which is, has been a sophisticated international city, every single nook and cranny is becoming filled up with refugees. I went to a block of flats with actually Armenian Syrians right in the heart of the city, in the kind of Armenian community, and you go to the top floor and all the flats are filled, and then there's a kind of what was the rooftop has now become an extra story on top, and they've kind of cleared things out and built a kind of fabrication there. And I met, exactly as Nigel was saying, I met a woman there called Tala, and she was almost painfully embarrassed that she was living there and that she couldn't even provide the basic hospitality, because she was an English teacher, and yet her kids were waking up 4 or 5 times in the night going boom, boom, because that was what they'd seen. So it's literally like building sites. I mean, every place that there could be someone to stay is being filled up, and they're pretty much all filled up now.
Thank you. Nigel?
One of the earlier questions was about the impact on men and women being different. And I think, for men, there's particularly a challenge in Syria around violence, and I believe it's true that most of the people killed are men, and I've certainly met young men who have come out of Syria because of their fear about being coerced into one fighting side or the other. But the impact on women is also very difficult, and in these urban settings, women tend to be the primary caregivers. They tend to be the ones who have the responsibility for providing for the children, yet they find themselves staying in maybe a shop or a garage, no way of having an income, and yet still having that pressure of needing to provide for their children. So there's very real emotional pressures on women, and often, women are alone because the husband has gone back, as we heard earlier, to look after assets and things back at home. So they can become more vulnerable, and there have been reports of increase in sexual and gender-based violence, and even of sort of younger women. Well, if we're able to marry her, well, then we've found a long-term solution. So the emotional pressure and on people is quite intense.
Okay, thank you. A couple of questions around accountability. We can try to take both together. From the Guardian Development on Twitter, governments have pledged money, but it's not getting through. What can the DEC appeal do to hold them to account? And the second question from Matt Pershani on Twitter: how do you work to ensure you are being accountable to the affected populations? Any takers on that one?
Well, I suppose on the disbursement issue, and obviously, if governments pledge money, we want to see that money made available to agencies who are supposed to be helping refugees as soon as possible. And that it does tend to get snared up in the system, and the DEC can, I think, put pressure and say, look, the people who are giving money to this appeal are stepping up, and they're making money available, and everyone else should do the same thing, from the international community all the way down. It's really important that we make the resources available for this appeal.
Certainly I'll come to you in a moment, Nigel. Certainly from a DEC appeal point of view, we're working with the 14 leading agencies who all have fantastic accountability systems in place. We, as the DEC who collect the funds, of course, are accountable to the public that we raise the money from, so we do hold our members to account on how that money is spent. And likewise, I think the public need to hold their governments to account who have pledged these money wherever they may be. Nigel?
I was just going to say on sort of accountability to beneficiaries. I mean, all of our organisations have learnt over the years that having the intent to do good is not good enough. You actually have to listen to the people you're trying to help, and there are some cross-sector principles that have been agreed that we've all signed up to. And that sounds terribly dry, but what it means in practice is actually having people on the ground whose job it is to listen. So having focus groups discussions with refugees where you actually sit down and listen to what they're saying those issues are. I was in a focus group with a group of refugee women, and it was just us saying, what are your issues? What are the problems? Tell us so we can understand. What do you think of the quality of what we're doing? Give us that feedback so we can change. Working in the camps, again with sort of community leaders. So within a block of tents or caravans, as they're called, having one of those sort of locally elected to represent them. So they can talk to them and say, what are the issues? Is there a problem with drainage when it's heavy rain, and so on. So we invest a lot of energy and time in really trying to listen to the people we're helping.
Just to say that about 2 million assistance on a consistent and regular basis. So there's a measure of accountability there. The problem is to increase that registration means you also have to increase kind of the logistics pipeline of assistance going into the country. So at the moment, the Red Crescent cannot register any more people unless it has assurances that more items, more relief is going to be coming into the country. So at the moment it's stopped at 2 million, but we know there's probably more like 4 million people that are desperately in need of assistance. But if there's no way of meeting that need, it's senseless to register them for the time being and be held accountable. And we cannot be accountable for assistance that we can't deliver.
Julie, perhaps you can also answer the next question from Twitter. What special challenges do the Syrian Arab Red Crescent face in delivering aid?
Well, the Syrian Arab Red Crescent have been lauded up as kind of the main humanitarian actor, one of the few nationwide humanitarian actors within Syria. Red Crescent, Red Cross is recognisable throughout the world as being a lead humanitarian organisation. And because of its status as auxiliary to government in times of disaster, that also gives it a special recognition. The SARC, or Syrian Arab Red Crescent, at the moment is coordinating most of the humanitarian relief. And that relief is coming from the UN, it's coming from international NGOs and national NGOs. It's a big job for them. They were not doing this before the crisis. They were very much focused on first aid and health centres. This has been a very, very steep learning curve for the Syrian Arab Red Crescent to be convoying assistance throughout the country, crossing front lines, and having to negotiate with an increasing number of actors involved in the conflict to make sure there is safe access for all humanitarian actors within the country. So there's a huge onus on them to not only safeguard their own staff and volunteers, but also safeguard people, volunteers and staff with other organisations.
Thank you. And we recently had the president of the Syrian Arab Crescent come to do a moving and touching presentation to the board of the DEC about how challenging it was to protect the aid workers in doing their duty. Thank you, Julia. Any questions from the audience? A lady over here on the left. Yeah. Any other questions? Put your hand up and I'll come to you.
Hi, Louisa Shachar from Islamic Relief UK. We touched briefly earlier on the psychosocial support that's offered to children in schools. I was just wondering what the member agencies are doing to offer psychosocial support, not just to children, but everyone who's been affected and traumatised by the violence that they've witnessed and fled from.
Thank you.
Agencies are providing social support to women, men and families, particularly in the case of Christians. Visiting with one of the local organisations that we support, Palestinians based in refugee camps inside Lebanon. So Palestinians who have fled Syria but have arrived in Lebanon in existing refugee camps and being hosted by Palestinians in those refugee camps, and our local partner organisation working to integrate a number of those arrivals from Syria into their long-term psychosocial programmes that they provide for families in the refugee camps in Lebanon. And one of the great things about the way that we're able to work with our long-term partners is that when we have a humanitarian crisis like this, we can support our partners to integrate, people who are fleeing a crisis and bring them into some of the short but also the longer term work that we're doing. So whether that's psychosocial support or whether it's vocational training or whether it's enabling women to understand how to combat issues like violence within the household and things like that. So we are able to take on some of these longer term issues, even though we're also dealing with the fallout of a very significant crisis.
Thank you. There's a lady over there who wants to ask a question. Thank you.
Hi, it's Sarah from HelpAge International. I was just wondering how visible older people are in this crisis, because often they're less able to flee or to get to camps, or less able to kind of reach distribution points within camps. So I was just wondering if anyone who has been to the camps in Jordan or Lebanon has any examples of how older people are being supported.
I met, when I was in the Car Valley in Lebanon, I met a family with 17 of them living in a tent, and the grandmother of the family was in a wheelchair, in fact, and exactly as you say, quite physically moving, and they had left quite early from Lebanon before some of the other family members, in the way that Andrew said, so the family split, and she'd come ahead early because they recognised how vulnerable she was. What I was so impressed with was, again, the generosity and the care of the Lebanese communities, and they were actually sharing food and things with her. And I met a local, Lebanese kind of community leader who was particularly concerned about, in this case, people living with disabilities, and several of those were older. So you're absolutely right. It's a very real issue. I think some of you might have seen. I think one of the BBC reports had a woman who was 100 or 103 or whatever. Just an unforgettable experience to hear her talk about what she'd seen in her lifetime, and she didn't even really know where she was. So without a doubt, the situation for the older, who are particularly vulnerable.
Thank you. Gentleman over here.
I'm trying to sorry, I'm Brav. I'm a sort of independent blogger type person. I'm trying to put myself in the position of somebody who's reading all these tweets and is sort of on the fence about donating to DC or looking for excuses not to. And I suppose one thing that springs to mind is I can imagine someone thinking, isn't the UN supposed to take care of these situations? Isn't DFID supposed to take care of the situation? Isn't our kind of tax money and our governmental system supposed to take care of these situations? So can you just sort of clarify what the kind of division of labour is between private NGOs like yours and government agencies, both in terms of supply of funding and in terms of who's actually doing what on the ground, both in Syria and among refugee communities in the surrounding area? Thanks.
Anybody want to? Julia?
I'll start something. The scope and scale of this crisis means it's a collective effort. It's not up to government or the UN or the international NGOs. It's all of us have a part to play. Certainly within Syria and in the surrounding countries, we do have a kind of a cluster system in place which denotes who takes the lead in any particular sector, whether it's the health sector, relief sector, water and sanitation and so on. But we can only fulfil our role within that cluster system if we have the necessary resources. Otherwise, you're just turning up to meetings and talking. Agency is able to do is a very important part of the collective effort, but we do need to back that up with the resources and to be able to commit to doing something and then go out and do it. So that's one of my colleagues.
So we do have those coordination mechanisms, as it were, in place, and we do, as agencies, encourage all the partners that we work with in turn to make best use of those. But that doesn't mean that there aren't unmet gaps and that people don't fall through those gaps. So, for instance, in Lebanon, I spoke to young children who had tried to get registered at the official schools and weren't able to, hence our partners stepping in and providing alternative education. Similarly, some people are scared to register with the UN for political or other reasons. They're not quite sure about the consequences, and in those situations, we as organisations and the partner organisations that we work with can provide some of those much needed services. At the same time, we will be able to signpost and refer people who do want to access the official UN or government provided services to help them do that. So we do our very best to make sure that we're really targeting those needs that aren't otherwise being met.
Yeah, and building on those points, really, I mean, you want to recognise what the UN is doing and what the governments are doing. I mean, in Oxfam's case, we're partnering with UNICEF to provide water and sanitation services in the camp. But as Oliver was saying, there's always these gaps, and there's this kind of human element. And I mean, even if we look at the UK, where you have the NHS, which is a extraordinarily well-resourced organisation, and yet there are still lots of UK-based charities. And trying to meet those gaps, trying to be that kind of human connection in a way that civil society groups can be, that governmental institutions struggle sometimes. So I think a big part of our role is to be the human element, is to actually have the time to sit and listen to people, to talk to people. It's more than just getting food and water. It's knowing that someone cares. It's that solidarity. It's that, are you talking about this? Do the people in the UK know what's going on? Do they care? And I think helping communicate that and be, sort of civil society to civil society, the humanness of it is a really important part.
Andrew. I think the best way to leverage money from governments in the UN is to give them a clear mandate to spend that money. And there's no better way than by setting an example yourself, by making that donation. And that's really the best way to put pressure on and to show that, yes, the people in the UK do care about this situation. We want to see something done about this. And that money that comes through on the DEC is flexible. We can spend it, on the projects that we need to spend it on, and it comes quickly. As soon as that money is donated, it's available to agencies to spend, which isn't always the case with the multilateral donors. So it really is the best way to leverage more money from across the world, really.
Thank you. Time is flying. We have less than 9 minutes left, so I'd ask people to please send in their questions as quickly as possible. Next question I'll do from Twitter, and I'll come back to the audience, the lady over here and the lady over there. How are local communities and NGOs in neighbouring countries reacting to refugees' arrivals? Somebody want to take that one? Andrew? And then Nigel.
I was in a town called Obid in Jordan where an enormous number of Syrian refugees had arrived. And the local community were under quite a lot of pressure, actually, from this new arrival. There was a building designated as the town, which was designated as a place for widows, Syrian widows who were arriving to come, live with their children, be some of the safety in numbers. And the kids were all playing outside in front of this building. And I was really struck, actually, that despite all the economic pressure that this influx had put on them, and despite the fact that that they couldn't afford to rent rooms anymore in this town, because sort of from the Jordanians to the Syrians there, an understanding that this wasn't by choice and this was by necessity, and an understanding that they needed food. And Jordanian organisations are giving up spaces that they would have otherwise used for things, and giving up time and resources, and teachers, as we know, we've heard, are working double shifts to teach these. There's an enormous sort of sacrifice happening on behalf of the neighbouring countries to host these refugees, and I think it's extraordinary and admirable that that's happening.
Thank you. Lady over here, this microphone.
I just have a question as a follow-up to the previous one. For all the people out there, we've just retweeted the donation telephone number and how they can get involved. But I'm sure a lot of them will ask themselves the question of how their money is spent. Could you elaborate a little bit, just to encourage them, obviously, how you're prioritizing? And I know you have a lot of work to do. I know that's the hardest question. And how their money is going to be spent. And if they don't decide to donate, are there any other ways they can get involved? Volunteer, retweet, post, and so on.
Thank you. Justin, and then Julia.
I think the first thing to say, and the question is, there is nothing better that you could do today, any of us sitting here, I don't just mean myself included in that, than give money to the Disaster Emergency Committee Appeal today, because we are there on the ground, all of us together. We work together. The mantra of DEC is that together we're stronger. We are the leading agencies in this country, and we're working on the ground, whether it's food, water, shelter, whether it's caring for children that have been through hugely traumatic events, all the things you've done there. We're doing all of that together, and we have clear standards. You can trace the money from the minute you donate it right to the point of delivery, and we will report back on that. You can trust us, and it makes a difference. And I think all of us here, we should put our hands in our own pockets as well as tweeting. But getting the message out, retweeting stuff, journalists speaking out, I think that's the other most powerful thing that can be done. Get that message out about this, because it is being undertold to the world at the moment, this situation.
Absolutely. Let's please keep that momentum going. Thank you. Last question from the audience, lady over here, and then we'll go back to Twitter and wrap up.
I was just going to say, the appeal asks for kind of the £5 text and that kind of thing. Can you quantify, if someone's thinking, yeah, I'm going to give my £5, what could that get someone in Syria or get you to help them on the ground?
Well, £5 could actually provide essential medicines to keep somebody alive. So it's that critical. As low as £5 sounds, it could save somebody's life. I don't know if somebody wants to add. No? Great, okay. Right, the final question, and then if you can just wrap up on this, and I'll just go round, is someone from Twitter would like to hear something about the stories of particular individuals that some of the panel members have met on their recent trips. So I'll start with you, Julia.
Met a number of people. Inside Damascus, a lady really stood out. She and her family, her husband and 7 children, had escaped from Homs 2 years ago when the fighting first started. And I asked how they were living, and she said, well, we just are. We're just moving from place to place almost on a monthly basis. With such a large family, it was quite hard for them to find accommodation. They started out with kind of friends, being put up by friends, but that was very difficult for the friends to kind of look after them. They'd been living in abandoned schools and other shelters, and literally they were just moving on a regular basis, just finding anywhere. It had been very, very difficult for them, and as it was really quite bad, and this was the result of not having a proper wash, or bath for nearly 2 years, not having access to clean water, not having access to soap, and her whole body was really suffering. And she was at the hospital to get some free healthcare, just some cream to alleviate that. Her son was also with her. He was a 12-year-old. He'd broken his arm, as children that age are inclined to do. But it just showed how precarious it was for them. Not to have a secure and permanent shelter, but then also to be so dependent on a health system that was struggling to cope, month by month, with people that were going in with a range of ailments, whether it was the chronic diseases, or whether it was accidents, or whether it was the result of living like she was doing for so long.
Oliver?
When I was recently in Beirut, I met a family who had been living in a 2-room apartment, 15 of them in 2 rooms for almost 2 years. They had decided quite early on in the conflict, because the father had previously been working in Lebanon, that they were going to leave Syria as a family and relocate to Lebanon. At the time, it didn't seem like such a big decision to make. They could afford the rent, and it was quite a squeeze in the room, but they were going to get by for a few months. Now it's almost 2 years on. The rent's gone up a number of times, and they're really struggling. One of the young boys, Sami, I met, told me about how he had wanted to enter school in Lebanon, but had been unable to do so because he had not reached the required standard in Lebanese schools, because the curriculum's different. And they said that if he wanted to go to school, he'd have to drop 3 years, and he didn't want to do that. He'd feel very out of place, he said. So instead, he was going to some alternative education provided by one of our partner organisations locally. And since he's done that, he's got a lot more confidence. He feels he's making progress not only in his studies, but has a possibility of learning for a vocation and studying for that later on. He doesn't know when he's going to be going back to Syria, but he thinks that in the meantime he wants to progress as far as he can in his education, and when the time comes he wants to learn, maybe become a chef and support his family in that way. He doesn't know whether that's going to be in Lebanon or Syria, but his determination was quite remarkable, I thought, living in very difficult circumstances with his family and not knowing quite what the future held, but really wanting to stick with his family and battle it out together.
Thank you, Oliver. Nigel?
Well, a number of stories, but I think the one that's kind of stuck with me the most is meeting a lady in Jordan who had a really young baby. I mean, you know, very small baby. And it's like, wow, that's really not an old baby. And sort of, you know, when did you have it, sort of thing. And it turned out, it turned out that she'd been living at home in the village when the fighting had arrived in that village. And so, in a lull in the fighting in the night, they had fled to a nearby village, found somewhere in a village hall to kind of kip for the night. That was the night she went into labour, because she was due. She had the baby, just with the support of her husband and the folk there. And then the fighting kind of came to that village as well. So within 24 hours of having gone through labour, she was on the run again. As a parent myself, and having watched my wife go through labour, the idea of then saying, right, love, we've got to leg it, it just really, it drove home to me how desperate the situation had been, to feel compelled to move within 24 hours of having gone through labour. And then they went to village until they just decided, enough, we just have to get out of here, we just have to leave the country. And they just left with what was on their backs, just to find somewhere safe where they didn't have to keep running night after night.
Andrew?
I think the person that stands out for me was a girl I met in Jordan called Rakea, who, she was 12, and she'd been walking down the street in Syria on the way to France, carrying her little walking with her other little. Her two sisters had seen her mum lose her leg, and Rakea's arm, where she was holding her baby, was lost. She lost her arm as well. And she'd come to Jordan, and she was living in a tiny room. There were 20 odd people living in this apartment, and I spoke to her and asked her about, you know, how things had been. She'd arrived in August, and how she was feeling about being here. And the only thing she wanted to do was go back to Syria. She just wanted to go home. And we asked earlier about what signs of hope do you think there are here? And for me, that's the biggest sign of hope, that somebody who could have been through such an extraordinarily terrible experience could want to go back, want to go home, want to go and resume life in Syria after something like that. Just really sort of, you know, hit me hard. I was you know, really amazed that she wanted to do that. And I think that if she could want to go home, then we really owe it to her and all the other children like her to do everything we can to make that happen, and to make the period
for a wonderful event today. We've managed to start a trend on Twitter, so that's a first. Heard some useful questions and insights into the context and the situation in Syria. I want to thank everybody that participated online and on Twitter, and urge everybody to please keep the momentum going. Urge people to give online, dec.org.uk, and to, of course, text if they can on DEC on 70000. I think that's 50750. So thank you all. I'd also like to thank BT again for giving us this wonderful venue and making this event possible. The team who've actually made the event possible today, including Stuart Folks and Leon, and from BT, Karen Ahern and Beth Courtier. So thank you all very much. Until the next time we have an event, thank you all.